So now we're going to finally get into that calculator that we've been talking about, the retrospective assessment calculator tool for cash crop. We also have one for almond, as Michelle mentioned earlier. This worksheet is, or workbook, I'm sorry, is organized into 12 worksheets, starting out with a README worksheet, and then we have one just for general farm information. We have 4 worksheets, one for each of the 4 conservation practices. And then we have that combined practice effects worksheet, which we've been talking about, housing effects that can't be really parsed out to individual practices. After that, we've got 2 partial budget analysis worksheets. One of them is protected, and the other one is not. It's an editable version for producing that publishable table. We have 2 worksheets in there for the PBA just because there's so many formulas in this workbook, and to try to shrink down a full-size partial budget analysis to show just what you want in the workbook, you run the risk of losing some of those formulas, and the numbers might change magically on you, which would not be good. So you'll see what I mean when we get into the calculator here a little bit. At the very back end, we have 3 supporting worksheets, prices and sources, machinery cost information, and then lists that are used for drop-down menus in the worksheet itself. So we're going to take a look at, I believe this next one says, yeah, show Dan Lane's calculator. So that's what we'll do here. This is the calculator for, I believe, did I put the wrong one up? Let me see. Let me take a quick look to see. Oh no, this is Dan's. They all look the same at the beginning. I didn't trust myself. So this is Dan Lane's calculator. As I promised, we're starting out with a README tab here at the very beginning, basically giving an overview of how the workbook is organized, which we just kind of talked about. I've got some general information here about how the calculations work in the workbook itself. Calculations for costs and benefits are happening on each of the worksheets. We have a little description of how erosion benefits are spread out across the study area. And then a tip here about making sure that you enter negative values as negative, enter reductions as negative values and increases as positive values, and any changes for yield, fertilizer use, and agrochemical use. We've also highlighted this on the Farm Info tab, that second tab after the README tab. We want to make sure that there's a section there for filling in rotations, and even if a farmer doesn't change their rotation, they need to complete both the benchmark and the current rotation table with identical information. Otherwise, later on in the workbook where we have the conservation crop rotation tab, it'll start calculating some changes based on whatever's in this table. And I'll show you that when we get into the workbook. Then we go through each of the other practices. We have tillage, cover crops, nutrient management, conservation crop rotation, that combined practice effects. And then the partial budget analysis, a little description about how that table's organized in the workbook. We've already talked about that a little bit earlier in this training, so I won't spend time on that now. Keeping going down this tab, be sure to create a new version of the workbook for your soil health farmer. Rather than just using this one, make sure you've got one dedicated just to your farmer. Also a note, the workbook is protected. So whenever you see a cell with this color, that's a cell for data entry. Everything else in the workbook has been protected except for this README tab and the editable partial budget analysis tab, which we talked about a few minutes ago. So I can click anywhere I want to on this page, and I could change anything I want to. I left it unprotected though, because I wanted to make sure that when you get down here to the sources for information in the workbook, these are live links. They'll take you to the source that I found for all these various price and cost information that's used throughout the workbook. And I kind of glossed over this area, but this gives you instructions on how to create a clean version or publishable version of the partial budget analysis using that editable PBA tab. So before we get into the workbook itself, I'm going to go to the way back here and talk about that supporting information. On these brown tabs at the back, we have the prices and sources used throughout the workbook. There's the producer price index for doing some updating. I've got the labor rate here. This is used for time the farmer spends learning about soil health practices. That comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I've got national average crop prices that we're using throughout the workbook for these crops. I also have organic crop prices. If it's an organic farm, there are cells that you can fill in to say, yes, I'm organic, and these prices will automatically be used in the workbook rather than the regular conventionally raised crop prices. Here's some more, another index. We have some information down here on how the sheet and rill erosion benefits are calculated in the workbook. If they had a reduction in their erosion rate, they're tied to the value of the nutrients that are in the soil that are no longer leaving the field. Then we have some standard fertilizer prices. We also have the net income information that's used in the conservation crop rotation tab if there was a change in rotation. So this is the prices and sources tab, and you see all these little locks here. I'll just point that out, indicating that all of these worksheets are protected. Here's the machinery tab, and you can see that we have, I've highlighted some columns here where we have the cost for the equipment itself that's being used in the workbook. So we have overhead charges for the tractor and for the implement used. These charges are comprised of not only like the cost of operating the machine itself when it's going over the field, but also depreciating its purchase price over a 10-year period. It also includes housing costs and all the other costs that go along with owning and operating a piece of equipment. Likewise for the implement. And so you can imagine if someone were to change the machinery they were using going from chisel plowing to no-till, we can take into account the changes in these costs, also take into account the cost of purchasing that piece of equipment and running it. And so we've kind of taken all of those considerations into account when we come up with this total price per acre. And you can see I've got 2017 here. This was at the time that I pulled this data set from the University of Illinois Data Farm Doc webpage, which is way down here at the bottom. So if you're really interested, you can click on that and go see those field operations information that I used for this. At the time that I pulled that information, it was 2017 data. I had to update it to 2018 data, and I used a producer price index to do that, which is also appears at the bottom of this page. Then finally, we have all the lists here on this tab, and these, like I said before, are used for the drop-down menus found throughout the workbook. So it's just coming back here, there's a formula, and it just looks up this list, drops down, you can pick the appropriate piece of equipment that you're looking at, and it'll plug it into the cell. So now we'll go back to the beginning. I'm going to just jump in real quick to the Combined Practice Effects tab, which comes after the farm info, tillage, each of the other practices. But because we already talked about that yield change and the change to nutrients, remember in the questionnaire we had that information come up, and decided it was a combined practice effect. So that's where this information is put into the workbook. And you can see here the reported change of 40 bushels per acre for the corn. The author, Brian, put soybeans in here as well, but soybeans didn't see a change. So there's nothing in here, even though the soybean price shows up, there's no calculations. And you remember when I was talking about the regular prices versus organic, this is where you would, if you say had an organic farm, you would just turn this to yes, and it would put in that information for the organic price, and you can see it went up to 936. By the way, you can put any value in here other than yes, and it'll just default to the value of the regular crop price. The only thing that will make this turn to organic price is either a capital or lowercase y. Otherwise, it's just going to use the standard crop price to do these calculations. Down below, here we see the additional nutrients, again, under combined practices that were populated in here. The standard price is used to get the cost change per acre for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. They're totaled up here, about $65 an acre increase in cost by increasing all these nutrients, and it's costing him an extra $59,000 a year due to that change in nutrients. All right, so we'll go back to the farm info tab and just kind of work our way through the rest of the workbook and end up at the partial budget analysis at the back end of it here. So we're starting out, we've got the farm name or farmer name, in this case Homewood Farms, the location of the farm in terms of its watershed, and then here we have that table with the rotation. Brian has filled in both the benchmark rotation and the current rotation, and they are identical. So no change is going to take place on the conservation crop rotation tab. We'll go over there and just take a quick check just to see what this looks like. It's pulling those rotation information in, and you can see it brought in the acres, it brought in net income. Again, that came from the prices and sources tab back here. For each of these crops, it's doing there's some lookup functions. It's going to find that information, plug it in here, give you the per acre, and then the total for all acres, add it together, and you can get a weighted average per acre cost here of $282. This takes into account if, for example, if you had different acreage amounts between the corn and the soybeans, it would actually calculate a weighted average for you. So then down here, it's all the same information. So these two zero each other out, which is what we want. He didn't change his rotation. We don't want to see a change in net income due to rotation change because there was none. And so that's what you would expect to see in this table. So let's jump back here to the Farm Info tab. We'll go down here. This is where you put in information about the education. Remember, he said he spent about 2 weeks a year, 80 hours. We have that standard labor rate, which is cited here of $24.42 per hour, the source of where that came from. It does the calculation here. The number of acres is brought in from up here, and we get $1.07 per acre cost for the education. So now we'll move into the tillage tab. And here, this should look a little familiar to the questionnaire that we saw earlier. These are the equipment he was using before for conventional tillage. And what's happening here is this per acre cost is populating automatically, pulling it from the machinery tab that we just looked at a short time ago. If I were to use the drop-down menu here and say I wanted to pick a different piece of equipment, we'll go with a 40-foot chisel plow, it's changing that cost per acre. By the way, the reason it went down, it's a wider piece of equipment, so the per acre cost, even though it's a more expensive piece of equipment, the per acre cost will go down just because it's covering a wider part of the field. But we're back here at what we started out with the $14 per acre charge for the chisel plow that the farmer is actually using. And then we come down here and we see that we've got the number of passes. We go from 7 passes up here, and we've dropped 3, so we're just down to 4 passes. It's calculating out the cost per acre up here based on the number of passes, totaling it up. Same process down here, and as we expected, he's saving money. He's going from $63 an acre down to $42 an acre because of this change in equipment that he's using. I also want to point out that he's got spraying here for both before and after. This is going to become important when we look at the cover crop part of it. We don't want to double count spraying, and we see that he's already got spraying covered before his tillage in this table. So we wouldn't expect to see a termination cost for cover since it's already happening here before the tillage. Going down, we've got soybeans, same thing. We saw this in the questionnaire. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but we basically put that information in. It ran the numbers. We've got room for more crops. If there's 2 other crops that they have in their rotation, they can show up here. And then the summer information is summarized down here, both per acre, benchmark, total acres per acre with treatment, and total acres with treatment. We sum it up over all the acres in both cases, do the subtraction, and we end up saving over $44,000 a year, or about $24 an acre saving. So remember, negative is a decrease in cost, and so he's saving $24 an acre by the change in equipment. And we already talked about those yield changes being under the combined practice effects. We don't use it here, we don't show it, we don't show the nutrient change, no change in pesticide use, and the erosion benefits, we talked about that. He really didn't have any to report, and we don't have any other benefits or costs. But as you can see, this is pretty much following that questionnaire that we saw earlier, and so it helps, hopefully it's not too hard to translate that information over here into the workbook. Now we're on the cover crop tab, and this is different from tillage because we have the cover crop costs here at the very beginning, which we saw briefly there on the questionnaire. He's only doing cover before corn, even though Brian entered soybeans here. He's not doing a cover. You could have just left this blank. But we have the corn. He's doing 400 acres of cover. He's got his cover crop seed, his establishment cost, no termination cost. That's zero because it's being terminated back on the tillage tab with the spraying. That's where he's showing it there. And that makes sense because he's only got 400 acres planted to cover here. And he's doing the spraying on all of the land that's going into corn. So that would be the logical place to cover that cost of spraying. The rest of this is the same until we get to the very bottom. And so I'm just going to go down there. And here we have the grazing and haying cost portion of the questionnaire translated into the calculator. We're showing general value of $140. I've got the source indicated at the bottom of the table here. It came from NASS agricultural prices. It's dated 2019, but this is a 2018 value. They published in 2019 their 2018 values, if that makes sense. We start out here asking for infrastructure costs. If they're going to graze, you know, what are your upfront costs? We have to find out how many years of life, what their planning horizon is, what interest rate they're using. This is used for annualizing these fixed costs up front, the fence costs, the watering facilities that they had to invest in if they want to graze their cover. We have to spread that out over their life or whatever planning horizon the farmer is interested in. And then we have some annual costs here, additional labor and management each year, and any additional other costs that are associated with grazing if they were going to graze their cover. And then there's the questions having to do with the cow-calf pair, dairy, or stockers, depending on which type of livestock they're going to be putting out on their cover to graze. If they're not grazing and they want to do haying, then this information down here would be completed, the number of acres hayed, what the yield is, and what their cost is for harvesting the hay or the silage. The next tab is nutrient management. And here we can see we've got the same kind of setup that we saw on the tillage tab, where we have machinery changes. And Brian went ahead and put this information in, but like I noted earlier, he really didn't add a pass over the field. We don't see that strip till banding pass here because that's happening with the tillage. It's going over with the tillage machine. It doesn't count against the farmer as an extra pass over the field. So there's no change here between before and after for his nutrient management fertilizer applications. If we go down here to this table, you'll see the same costs, and so they cancel each other out. And so there's really zeros. And then the rest of the nutrient management, there really weren't any other effects that were mentioned in the questionnaire. So we don't need to have any more information on this particular tab. And we'll move on to the conservation crop rotation, which we already looked at, just to check to make sure that we didn't show a change in net income based on the way the rotation was entered with the benchmark and with the new conservation crop rotation. He didn't change his rotation, they're the same, so that's zero. And then we have all these other effects down here. So once you get the hang of it, the first tab takes a little bit of time because maybe the first time going through the effects, but the effects are similar as you go from one tab to another. They change a little depending on the practice, but not a whole lot. The next tab, of course, is that combined practice effects tab, which we looked at earlier. And now we get to the partial budget analysis. And you can see why it's important to have an editable version of this tab. This table here, the locked version, has every possible effect that could be recorded in the preceding tabs shows up in this table. And there's a lot of if-then calculations. It's doing an evaluation here to show, and I'm going to just unprotect this sheet so we can look at a formula here. If we went to here, you can see it's checking to see if a certain value is greater than 0. If it is, in this case, it's a yield increase, then it's going to put it in here. Otherwise, it's just going to say, no, it's not greater than 0. We did have a yield change for all practices, and I should mention that I created these little guidance columns on the side actually for myself when I was developing this workbook, just because of all the effects that are showing up in here. It was a little overwhelming and hard to keep track to make sure that I'm showing everything, that everything is coming in the correct location. So these are just guidance. 329 is the NRCS code for residue management no-till. I used NRCS codes just because that's my history, but we do have them translated at the very beginning of the workbook. So if you're not sure what 340 is, for example, you can go to the README tab at the very top here, and it tells you 340 is cover crops. So just a little side note about my side notes. But anyway, if we get back to this, in the combined practice effects all practice, we have if combined practice effects is G17 is greater than 0, then plug in that yield impact due to soil health practices. And likewise, this if-then analysis carries through this other cell here to bring in that value, the acres, and so on. So that's how this tab works, this workbook sheet. All of these cells are looking back in the various tabs of the workbook, pulling in information if it's appropriate. And you can see we have a few here. I think there's one more down here, impact of soil health on the nutrients used. And then all of this information gets summarized here at the bottom. And you can see we have the same numbers. We just have a whole lot more stuff up here that we need to clean up and get rid of. So that's why I have those instructions back on the README tab on how to clean up your partial budget analysis using the editable PBA tab. So you still have all the actual numbers back here with all the formulas, and this tab should be protected. I unprotected it just to show you the formulas, but normally it would be protected. So you know that all those numbers are going to hold fast, they won't change. When you start playing around and shrinking it up, it's quite possible that you may affect some of the formulas. And so you have this other one to go back to just to check to make sure everything is okay. And when you get all done, the easiest thing to do is just to look at the numbers at the bottom, make sure these numbers match the numbers back here. And if you don't, if they do, then you know you've done it correctly and you've succeeded in shrinking your table down so that it will fit into a publishable document. Now, I'm just going to take a quick look back here to the presentation. Let's see what's next. I was hoping this was next. I'm going to talk about how to create an informative partial budget analysis table as opposed to what we saw back there on the version that is, well, this one's actually already informative. This is the edited version. But if you look at this one, we have change in machinery cost due to change in tillage, which is pretty non-descriptive. As you know, it's going back to a cell and it's pulling C99 back here on the tillage tab. So if we go down to C99 on the tillage tab, you will see that it's basically, oops, I'm sorry, C90, it must be this one. Change in machinery cost due to change in tillage. I must have read the wrong number, C90, oh, C90, there it is, yeah. So it's going back to C90 to pull this. It's evaluating C99 to see if it's less than 0, and then it's pulling this, meaning it's a savings if it's less than 0, and then it's pulling C90, change in machinery costs due to change in tillage, because when I put these together, we don't know whether this is going to be a positive or negative effect. And so that's the chore, or the task that's before us now, is to make these seem more meaningful in this table here. And you can see they've already been made more meaningful. What we had done is created a document that takes those wording, the wording generated in the workbook, and has suggested wording for publication, whether it's a benefit or a cost. So we're making that distinction over here. If it's a benefit, then we say machinery cost savings due to, and you can either enter in strip till or no till. Or if it's a cost, then you would say increased machinery cost. So using our example, if we then go back to the workbook we were just in for Dan, we can see that we've already done this. We've got increased corn yield due to all of the soil health practices. We have machinery cost savings due to strip till, and we've gone above and beyond by saying he's putting in 3 less passes a year. And so this is something, it's like a value added thing. First, we have the standardization brought about by using this document. So we have pretty standard wording, but it's more descriptive. But then we go a little bit beyond that by giving a little bit more information to make it a little bit more colorful by saying, okay, well, this is based on 3 less passes a year. Likewise, he's getting 40 bushels more yield. And so those are the changes that I'm just going to back to my slide here just to show you. Better still, add quantitative descriptions of the effects, as in our example below, which we just talked about. So one thing I want to do, let me just check to see where I am. Challenge is translating information from the questionnaire into the calculator. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit with a different example. And this is the Macaulay Farm. This is in upstate New York. And we had a situation here, and I think it seems to be New York State is more complicated than the Midwest. More topography, smaller fields, different types of rotations, different crops being grown. And as you can see, this is kind of a small farm. He went with no-till and now has to spray 132 acres of his corn before planting for weed control. And what we found is that on that farm, he also had some of the ground before going to corn was coming out of wheat the summer before. And so in upstate New York, wheat is harvested around mid-July, mid to late July, or really mid-July. And so after that, you can imagine there's plenty of time to get a cover crop established. Corn and soybeans come off much later in the year, and the way the seasons are around here, it's really tough to get a good cover growing. So many farmers take advantage of their winter wheat harvest that comes off in mid-July to plant cover. And so that's what this guy's doing. He's putting in 61 acres of cover in the summer before going into corn. But we see he's got a lot more going into corn than just that 61 acres. Another complexity here is that the cost of spraying the cover crop itself before planting the corn is $12 an acre, but the farmer spends $16.55 for ground that doesn't have cover. So in other words, the balance of his ground that's not in cover, he's spending more money than he is with his cover crop. So we had 2 things we had to talk about here. One is how to accurately portray that difference in spraying cost, and then how to avoid double counting the costs associated with the double cover crop versus the tillage change. So here we are in the questionnaire for Macaulay, and you can see this is the tillage section of the questionnaire. This is the pesticide table, and he's citing out his costs for spraying the corn. If he didn't use a cover, it's $16.55 an acre. That's the increase that he actually saw. And then he's also spraying his soybean, but for simplicity's sake, we're just going to talk about corn, although it's the same process. Then we also have the wheat cover down here. It's actually his cover crop following wheat at $12 per acre increase. And the author here, Aaron, here in New York, wrote a note about this. He says the wheat cover crop costs are not captured in tillage. This cost of $12 an acre was moved to the cover crop, but I left it here in red to remind me that it's being accounted for. So he just makes notes to himself in the questionnaire explaining why he did certain things. Now, if we go to the calculator for Macaulay, we have a solution here in the tillage tab. We basically left the spraying pass off of that operations no-till corn. You see there's no spraying in here for no-till because of the cost differences. If we were to put spraying in here, it would have been used on all 132 acres, and we know that's not correct. We know it was only used on a portion of the corn ground for that $16.55, the $16.55. So we don't put it in this table. What we're going to do is instead have it in the pesticide use table on that same tab, on the same tillage tab. We've put his spraying costs down here. So there's different options and flexibility in the calculator in terms of how you show things, but it's important to remember that you don't want to double count. You don't want to have the same thing showing up in a couple different places. And so what we've done over here, we have a side calculation demonstrating that he had 132 acres of corn total. He has 61 acres coming out of that cover crop following his wheat. So that leaves a remaining of 71 acres. So we're putting in 71 acres for the $16.55 cost for spray. Now, we also have to make sure that we cover the balance of that corn ground on the termination costs for his cover crops. So you may remember in Dan Hall, we didn't show any termination costs in the cover crop tab because his cover was being terminated. It had the same cost for all of the ground, and it was terminated with his tillage. So that was showing up on the tillage tab instead of the cover crop tab. So here we have the 61 acres of corn that had the wheat on it before with the cover crop, that $12 cost, and it does the calculation here. Okay, in the rest of my time I have left, I'm going to talk about tips for making adjustments to fit other production systems. Let me just check to make sure that I've covered everything else that I wanted to talk to you on that. I believe so. So I'm just going to get into how you can make some changes to the calculator, the way it's currently set up, if you're making changes, say, to a crop or some other operation that the calculator currently isn't designed to handle. Before you get into doing that, I showed you a couple formulas as we went through Dan Hall's example, and you need to bear in mind it's pretty complicated, and it is really, I think, important to have somebody with an economics background kind of looking over your shoulder to make sure that everything makes sense and you're not getting caught up in double counting or other errors. You know, maybe things aren't on the same basis per acre per year. You need to make sure that all the information satisfies those three criteria that I mentioned earlier for partial budget analysis, that everything has the same unit, it's the same price year, and everything is on an annual basis, and we don't double count. So there's all these little things that are kind of important that you need to keep in mind. It's helpful to have someone with an economics background guiding you or helping you with it. It's also really important to have experience with Excel, have knowledge of how VLOOKUP functions work, drop-down menus, and just formula construction, logic, if-then, nested formulas, and all that kind of thing. I have to say I learned a lot going through this. I thought I knew Excel until I got working on these calculators. It was a lot of fun. I learned a lot, but there's a lot you have to know in order to make sure those formulas are going to work the way you want them to. So if we do want to make some changes, there's some easy changes you can make. If you were interested in perhaps, say, changing just the crops being grown and the machinery that are being used, those are pretty straightforward. It basically means making edits at the back end of the workbook on the prices and sources, machinery tab, and the list tab. If, however, you're thinking about actually adding and changing practices, which is what we ended up having to do for the almond situations out there in California, that gets to be more complicated. It requires changing and adding tabs, maybe putting new tabs in for new practices, reestablishing connections and formulas, making sure everything links back to that partial budget analysis table there, and that everything is coming in the way you want it to. So there's quite a bit of work if you're contemplating actually changing the practices that are in the workbook. And you also should know that it could lead to examining different types of effects that could come into play from the ones that we have been looking at for our standard row crop operation. So I'm going to take you in to take a look at just the basic workbook. This is the same one. This isn't Dan Hall's. This is a blank version of that same workbook that we were just looking at. Nothing has been entered in here. And you can see that we're still pretty much protected, although I unprotected some worksheets in here just for the ease of demonstration as we go through this. So that's something that's important to remember as you go to make these changes. You're not going to be able to do anything until you unprotect the worksheet that you're working on. So let's go to the Farm Info tab here real quick. Whoops, and I already made a mistake. I had something in here. I'm demonstrating now the Clear All Data tab. I just clicked it there. I don't know if you saw me because I was running this earlier, just experimenting. So right now what's happening is it's clearing out everything entered in the workbook. That's why you never want to click this tab if you're actually using it and you've got some information, because anything that was entered in these yellow cells will get just obliterated. It'll be gone and you'll be starting fresh. Okay, so now let's say that we want to add a crop to the workbook, and I'm afraid that I may have messed up here because what I was going to do for my demonstration was to add barley to the crop. If we go back to the Prices tab, you see I've actually already done it. I've got barley in here, and what I had planned on doing was showing you how to add barley. So maybe instead of adding barley, I'll add another crop instead. What you have to do is you come back here to this tab, and normally this would not have been barley. I think this was soybeans before, so maybe I'll put soybeans back in here, and we'll just pretend that I can't remember what the price was for soybeans. But what I want you to do first is to unprotect this tab. It's already unprotected. If you needed to do that, the easiest way is to go to the File, Info at the front end of the workbook, and you can see there's, these are the tabs that are currently protected in the workbook. So like just for fun, we could unprotect the cover crop tab, or we could unprotect the partial budget analysis tab. Any tab that you think you might want to work on, you can unprotect there. If you actually wanted to protect the tab, you would come over here to the Format, Protect Sheet, and then I don't put any password protection in, so I just click OK, and now it's protected. You can't click anything. So you can also unprotect from here, so we'll just do that. All right, so now we're back here again. And what I want to do is put in barley instead. If we're back here on this tab, one thing you can do just to make sure that you're going to the right part of the workbook to make the change that you're contemplating is know that this is a drop-down menu. Because of that, you need to go to the Data Validation tab and look to see what list is source is being given for this tab. And so you can see it's taking you to Prices and Sources, cells A16 through A20. So that's how I knew to go back there, that and the fact that I developed the workbook. But if you obviously haven't developed this workbook and you're trying to figure out where to go to look at a formula, if it's a drop-down menu, go to Data, Data Validation, and then look for the source for that information here at where it says source right on the tab. So we're going to say, okay, we're good with that. We're not going to change it. We will go back here. We're going to take, no surprise, you know I'm going to change this to barley because I already talked about it. I left it in there by mistake. Barley is also sold by bushels, and this is the price of barley at $4.52. That's the 2018 price. I looked it up at National Ag Statistics Service and got a national average price for barley of $4.52. I'm not going to take the time to also put it over here in the organic prices. That involves a lot more research and effort to come up with organic prices, as you can imagine. But we've made that change. So now if we come back here and we want to say add barley, there it is. So we can put barley in. Now, you know, I changed the price as well. And that price information becomes important for any yield changes in the workbook. I'm not going to get into that right now, but just know that going forward, because that price is in there, if you take the time to enter rotations in here and take the time to enter additional data that you need to run the economic analysis, the price for barley will show up when you need to for any yield changes. Now let's just say that you want to make a change to equipment that's being used in the workbook. We have the equipment, the machinery complement back here, and what you want to do here is probably the easiest thing would be to swap out a piece of equipment. And so this part's pretty straightforward. You would need to make sure you have the 2018 total acre cost for what you think that equipment is, and then you can go in and just put the name in here, and all you really need is the value that goes in column N here. You don't need all the rest of this information. This is just showing how these cost values, especially these four columns here, fed into this 1885 per acre for this 2018 price. You know, it started out in 2017 and was updated. So if you have a 2018 price and you want to put a new piece of equipment in, you can do as simple as that, just subbing it in here. But the other part of it is, remember I talked about those drop-down menus. You want to make sure that the equipment that you're looking for is going to be on the list for the drop-down menu that you're using. And remember how I said earlier, how do I find out for sure which drop-down, where that drop-down list is? Because it's on the list tab, but maybe you don't know for sure which one it is. Again, I still have this data tab opened up. I've got data validation over here. We'll click on it, and you can see it's showing me go to A97 through A188 on the list tab. Okay, A97 to A188. A97 to A188, we go down here. So here we are. So here's the list. You can write in your new piece of equipment anywhere on this list that you desire and use it to populate a different type of tillage equipment in here. If you just want to change it for one operation, if the farmer just has a cost they want to use, the easiest thing is just to find a piece of equipment that most closely fits what that farmer is using, and then just type in whatever cost you want them to have for this. Notice that this is an unprotected sheet. This one shows as protected. This is protected, unprotected. So I'm able to just type in a different value here and use it. But just know that when I did that, I lost the formula. So if you're okay with losing the formula and just putting a value in there, you're welcome to do so. The formula is still here. If you're unhappy with that and you want to put it back, you can just do a copy and paste, and the formula goes back and it puts that piece of equipment in. So I see Michelle has come back on. Am I getting close to my time, Michelle?
Yes, you're 1 minute over, but I think you're very close to finishing, aren't you?
I am. I'm actually very close. Let me just see where I am on my presentation, because if I'm not mistaken, boom.
Yep.
We're into the Q&A. I should have put a Q&A slide up, but that's where we are. So
yep.
I guess we can start with that. So the first question I see here is, was the impact of continued soil degradation on soil health or productivity taken into account when assessing the benefits? So I guess in a way you could say only from the standpoint of what the farmer reported. So what we're doing is we're going from a baseline condition of whatever they had going on in terms of yield, and that's usually the easiest indicator of soil health, or even use of fertilizer back before they started their practices, and then comparing it to what they have now. And all of these changes are as reported by the farmer. We weren't going out there, we obviously didn't have the resources to go back in time and try to figure out, take soil measurements or soil testing at the time before they started soil health, and then actually taking those same measurements, you know, say 10 years later. So this is purely based on the farmer's observation of the changes to the soil, what they saw physically changing in the soil, and how that was manifested through any changes in yield or changes in, say, fertilizer use on the farm. So I hope that answers that question. It was not done where we actually went out and took measurements of the soil. The next question, I'm interested in partial budgeting being done as part of the conservation planning process with producers. Is this analysis too complex for the typical soil conservationist to be trained to do, and would they have time to do it? That's a tough question. I think, I think it depends. I think my goal was to make this tool usable by people who are not economists. Having said that, I still think it's helpful to have somebody involved with an economics background looking over your shoulder just to make sure that what you're doing makes sense. Or making sure that you have caveats associated with the work and looking at what these effects are, you know, to say that this is what the tool is saying, but actual effects may be different. Do you have anything to add to that, Michelle?
Yes, I think what we've tried to explain to you, and we'll go into a little bit of detail in the last session, is that we created essentially a 3-person team with a project leader, an economist, and the author interviewer. And that's what we're training to set yourselves up for, right? And so part of that equation is having an economist on your team. Until these economic calculators are put online, as you've seen, there's a lot of opportunity to break them accidentally if you're not familiar with Excel and if you're not an economist. So until we get them onto online tools, it's definitely very smart to have an economist on your team. And it'll still be smart to have an economist on your team even when they become online tools.
Thanks, Michelle. The next question is, why not include increased harvest costs, more bushels, and increased marketing costs in the analysis? And quite simply, that adds a whole new level of complexity to the analysis. We are trying to keep it as simple as we could for use by people who are not economists, but with economics oversight. Those sorts of cost increases are really best portrayed through crop budget analysis, where you have the whole crop budget laid out in terms of all the establishment activities, all the maintenance activities, like I mentioned at the beginning, and then the harvesting costs. And when you do that, then you have the opportunity to build in the additional costs for, say, if your yield goes up. Obviously, it is going to cost a little bit more to harvest that crop than it did before. But because of our goal here, trying to keep these fairly straightforward and not making them overly data hungry, there is a fair amount of data needed, but we were trying to keep that down to a minimum. And so we did create a more simplified version just for the sake of making it more usable and easier to get through the analysis. In the partial budget analysis, cover crops are planted.
Oh, you skipped over one, sorry, Flo, at the top.
Oh, I'm sorry. What interest rate did you use to annualize costs? I would have to go back to the University of Illinois. I think you're talking about the machinery costs here for University of Illinois. I would have to go back to their website and explore it to see what interest rate they were assuming when they depreciated the farm equipment that they used. That's where you would go, and that's why I provided all those links to the sources so that people in this training, if you're interested in seeing the data that was used, the standardized information, it's all there for you to go and explore and see on your own. Let's see, in the partial budget analysis, cover crops are planted on 400 acres, but increased corn yield is on 1,800 acres. Could you explain why you see increased corn yields even on acres where no cover crops were planted? Well, these are long-term effects. And so remember, we were looking at the beginning before he did any soil health practices to current, or 2018, when he was doing soil health practices. And these farms are in rotation. He's rotating around the farm, I presume, with the cover crop, and he's doing no-till. And no-till can also have an improvement in yield. Arguably, I think you could say that having something, living roots growing as much as you can throughout the year probably does more for soil health and fertility than not disturbing the soil. But nevertheless, no-till does have a positive effect. And because the cover crop, it could be rotated around the farm, over time, he could see an improvement in yield throughout the farm. How was machinery cost savings calculated? Machinery cost savings calculated in the case of tillage. Well, I think I covered this. We used the machinery complement from the University of Illinois. And quite, simply, we were looking at the machinery that the farmer used before, what its cost was to cover an acre of ground, and comparing that to the machinery that they're using now and the cost to cover. And so as we saw, he saved 3 trips over the field, and so was saving something like $24 an acre for machinery costs. When developing the interview, did your team come together and put definitions on common used terms for conservation practices? In particular, I think of the term no-till and the broad range of no-till that is implemented across the country. That's a really good question, and Michelle will tell you that we did talk about this because NRCS has very standard terminology when they're talking about various forms of tillage. And so we did have a discussion about that. I tried to keep it as close to the NRCS practice names, but when it comes to tillage, you're right, there are a bunch of different types of no-till. And I think what we ended up doing was just trying to be as descriptively as we could about what any particular farmer was doing for reduced tillage on their farm.
And I'll show a table that we modified per the definitions of tillage and residue during the comment section, because our Midwest director, Chris Reynolds, and our Midwest science director, Emily Bruner, both out of Illinois, thought that the table providing definitions during the comment interview was not as explicit and specific as it could be. So we brought that to bear in the conversation as well, and you'll be seeing that modified table later on.
Thanks, Michelle. Will you be describing how one would calculate the increased operative ownership cost if the farmer purchased a piece of equipment such as a no-till corn planter, or the cost of retrofitting their planter? Oh, that's a really good question, and the answer, unfortunately, is no, but that's a really good question, because obviously what we did was we just took those standardized prices from the University of Illinois. However, if a farmer had an idea of what they thought their upfront cost was for retrofitting a planter, and they knew what their useful life of the planter was, and they had an interest rate they thought was applicable, then you could amortize that cost and plug it in. You'd still have to add some operating costs and fuel use and so on, or the farmer may just say, hey, I think it costs me $12 an acre to use this piece of equipment, and I feel like that includes the cost of retrofitting. I mean, that's a kind of a stretch. If you were to do that, I think it would be a fair amount of work to come up with your analysis, but it is doable. It's just not something that we're prepared to do here. Sorry, I had to join late. And if I missed this information, will you be sharing, all be sharing the producer questionnaires or the Excel sheet on which to perform the analysis? So we are going to be providing a standard questionnaire and a workbook, but both of them are blank. I'm not sure that there's value in providing a completed questionnaire and workbook. And Michelle and I kind of talked about this. I don't know that we've made a final decision as to whether we're going to also provide you with the Dan Hall example.
Dan Lane, and we'll have to ask him
I'm
first.
sorry. Oh my gosh, I used to work with someone named Dan Hall. His ears are probably burning right now. Yeah. What did you say, Michelle? We haven't decided, right?
Yeah, and we will have to ask Dan Lane if we can do that.
If we're okay, if he's okay with that. Yes, thank you. The machinery costs are not specific to each state. We decided to use the Illinois cost list because it's pretty comprehensive. It's probably a best fit for the Midwest, but in my years as an NRCS economist in New York, I quite often relied on these lists from other states. They do have some variability, especially in New York, because I said we have smaller fields, and so the field efficiency isn't quite as high as it would be in the Midwest. But it's probably a good enough approximation. And so the answer to that is no, we don't have it for other parts of the country. We're just using a list that was developed in the Midwest. Our crop price index prices based on regions. The crop prices are national averages from National Agricultural Statistical Service. It's very easy to get state level data. And so if somebody is interested in just using their state's information, they can certainly do that. I showed you where those prices are in the workbook. So you could go to the back, plug in your own prices. That's real easy to do. If you're not changing crops or anything, just put those prices in and they will be used throughout your workbook. If the farmer is spraying multiple times in the cropping system, say before planting and post-emergent spraying, do you enter the spraying management more than once? Well, I think you saw that Dan Lane had multiple sprayings, and we just had 2 times or 3 times. I think before he went to reduced tillage, he was actually spraying 3 times for his corn, which seems like a lot to me. And so that was how we handled it. It was on that tillage tab for the equipment part of it, the number of times he was spraying. We just put it in there. The wage rate seems really low for a manager of an 1,800 acre farm. I actually started with a higher wage rate, and you make a really good point. And we did have a lot of discussion about this actually with some of the NRCS economists who helped us with it. And the wage rate that we ended up deciding on from the Bureau of Labor Statistics was kind of a compromise. It does seem low to me too, and I did start with a higher rate, but this came after we had some discussions with other folks. You're certainly welcome to use whatever rate you think is appropriate with the farmer. The farmer may have a rate they want to use, or you can go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and pick out something that you think might work better. Question on nutrient management. You had mentioned early on that Dan Lane had increased his nutrient application rates on his corn. But when we were reviewing the nutrient management tab, I don't recall seeing anything about the changes. You're right. We didn't put that on the nutrient management tab. And I believe I lobbied to put it there because it seemed like a direct effect of nutrient management. But the farmer really felt strongly about it being associated with more than one conservation practice. And so we went with what the farmer felt was the better way of portraying it, and we put it on the combined practice tab. And you probably remember seeing it there. I agree, I think it should have been on the nutrient management tab. But in doing these interviews, we really want to make sure the farmer's happy with how we're presenting things and that they feel it's an accurate portrayal of what they've done and how they're managing their farm. And so we don't really want to substitute our judgment for their own judgment. Next question. Oh, I think this had to do with the trying to get at the survey, Michelle. They're still not able to get it. I guess it would be good to know if anyone is still having trouble to put something in the Q&A about that, just to make sure that that problem has been solved. Next question regarding labor rates. Does it make a difference to distinguish who is driving the tractor? Are there hourly rate options between farm owner and hired hand? A farmer, or maybe the farmer uses their time at a higher hourly rate. Well, that's a really good point. You saw that table at the back of the workbook. You could go in there and plug in a labor rate that you want to use instead of what's there. Actually, you wouldn't be plugging in the labor rate. You'd have to figure out the cost per acre for labor and plug that in. There's probably tools that you can go to that might allow you to put in your own labor rate and calculate out a per acre cost for your equipment. And so that may be something worth exploring if you want to get something that's really more specific to the type of person that's actually driving the tractor. And I can't tell you right now what the University of Illinois is assuming when they set their labor rate. I think I remember seeing it was something like $18 or $19 an hour, whatever that tells you. How well does this calculator translate to grazing or hay operations? Well, the only thing in there right now is, like you saw in the cover crop tab. So I would say that if you're doing a lot of pasture and you have pasture grazing and haying, it would take some work to get it fixed. For haying might not be too bad because I already have hay in there as one of the crops, and it prorates the cost of establishment costs are prorated. I've taken that into account based on the number of years of hay in a rotation. The hay price is in there. You would have to build in, perhaps you'd have to put in some machinery changes if you wanted to have hay If you wanted to go to a grazing system, then that would be a lot different, I think, and would require some work. I think you would probably, you know, like I said before, it comes to making changes. You'd want to make sure you're really familiar with Excel, understand how those formulas work, have a good idea in your mind of how you would want to set it up for a grazing system, and what changes you would need to do. To be honest, I haven't really sat down and given that much thought for the calculator because we didn't have any grazers in the areas that we were doing these case studies on.
Yeah, we're very, we have a grazing project in Virginia, and so we're very interested in developing the grazing lands version of this calculator. You know, we look forward to hearing from you, Joshua Frey of Kentucky, if that's something that you're interested in collaborating with us on. Flo, don't forget to look at the top of your screen. There's a question about the almond analysis.
The very top.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, will you be able to see, will we be able to see your Excel spreadsheet for the almond analysis? I don't believe we were planning on sharing that one, were we, Michelle?
No, so I think what we'll try to do is at the end of this, there's going to be an email that some of you have seen before. It's a soil health training at farmland.org. I think it's SH training, SH for soil health training at farmland.org. And so if you email that and you put in your subject line, almonds training, please, then we'll get together a quorum of folks and put on an almonds special training just like this. So it's really too much to try to cover. As you can imagine, the practices are very different.
Thank you, Michelle. This next question is a good one. Do you normalize in any way? Well, they're all good questions. Do you normalize in any way for weather conditions for a particular year of analysis? And what we try to do is get the farmer to talk about typical years. We really don't, we want them, you know, we say we want them to report on what their current situation is, but we also don't want them to say be reporting yield in a drought year. And, you know, we want to say, what was your normal yield after you adopted these soil health practices? What do you normally get? Understanding that there's year-to-year variability. And so some of the farmers, you know, did have a yield change, but we're able to say, well, typically in a typical year now, this is what I get. By the way, and we also didn't necessarily put the entire yield change in. Many farmers qualified that by saying my yields were actually even, yield increases were even higher, but I know some of that had to do with changes or improvements in hybrid over the year. And so maybe actually my yield improvement that I could say was due to soil health was maybe 50% of this change. And so we did take that into account in the case studies, other factors that come into play for yield. Does the calculator have to be for each, specific for each state? Well, as you can see, the price information I used is national pretty much, or some of it's from the Midwest. So no, it's not particular for state. It's really more lined up for row crops or the types of crops that are grown here in New York, which are corn, soybeans, hay, wheat. So a few additional crops are added in, but it's primarily for row crops. And it could be used in a row crop situation pretty much anywhere in the country. If you wanted to put in your own local costs, as you saw, that would be a pretty straightforward thing to do. How can one separate the effect of nitrogen fertilizer increase from healthy soil practices related to yield increase? Well, that's a really good question too. I mean, the farmer Dan Lane did start applying a whole lot more fertilizer, and maybe you could argue that some of those yield changes were attributed just to having better nutrient management on his field. We did talk a lot about this when we were putting the analysis together and working with Brian on it, and the farmer really felt that his yield increases were, yeah, they were due to nutrient management, better nutrient management, but also the timing of the fertilizer application. Remember, he went from a single application to 2 applications. And he also said he felt it was attributed to the, I believe it was tillage change. And so you're right, nutrient management can do a lot for yield, and perhaps that yield change maybe is a little high for this one, but based on working with the farmer, that's what we came up with. When farmers reported increases in yield, were they comparing to a single year or an average of several years? I think I already covered this. It would have really been the latter, the average of several years, trying not to introduce factors of weather too much into the analysis and just looking at what a typical yield might be.
Just taking a look at the time flow. I've passed our break time at the 15-minute mark.
Yep.
We do have 3 questions left, so if we can run through those quickly, then we'll give everyone a 5-minute break, and then we'll start right up on the environmental methods section.
All right, I'll be real quick. I've already answered this question, I think. The calculator is on an annual basis. It's taking what were they doing before with what they're doing now, but all of the costs are in the same year. So they're all 2018 prices, but we're comparing with what they did before, what they're doing now. So it's like an annual basis. Regarding the farmer's length of operation and soil health building, do you foresee future work on increased SOM and other benefits? Well, that's exactly what we're trying to do with the prospective calculator that we're virtually done with. And so the answer to that is yes. We are trying to look at how SOM increases benefits and reduces drought stress. So that's exactly what we have on the table right now. Since the interview is based on farmer observations, you ask the farmer to verify or confirm the data provided having to do with their increases in income. No, we don't. If they have paperwork and they want to provide that to us, we're willing and happy to accept it, but we don't hold their feet to the fire and say we have to have documentation of this. We have to trust them. One of the footnotes on our table says that these effects are based on those reported by the farmer, and that's it. That's what we're saying. This is what the farmer said they experienced, and this is what we're putting in our analysis.
And I remember I reviewed Eric Niemeyer's Ohio case study and Jay Swede's New York case study, and I remember they put forth yield information on the table with both Brian Brandt and Aaron Ristow, and so we were able to do the math with them on the yield changes, and we wrote about that in the case study. So when available, we definitely wanted to document that as closely as we could.
Right, yep. We didn't disqualify someone because they didn't have the records, but you mentioned Conservation Security Program. Oh, you're right, Conservation Stewardship Program. Thank you so much. I get talking too fast, and it is the Conservation Stewardship Program. And I hope everybody appreciates the difference between those two, but since I've run out of time, I probably shouldn't get into it now. Thank you very much.